Hello and welcome. I'm Ada Pembroke. I'm a writer and astrologer and the founder of the Narrative Astrology Lab. And I am here with Lauren of Tarot and Chai. Lauren is a tarot reader and one of the members of the Narrative Astrology Lab. She's absolutely fabulous. And we are here to talk about the differences between stereotypes and archetypes, especially as they apply to the sign Cancer. Thank you so much for joining me today, Lauren.
Thank you for having me.
It's always a pleasure. I look for opportunities to do this sort of thing with you. So, stereotypes and archetypes. You've done some research on this. What's the difference?
Stereotypes are a more simplistic model. If we're talking about the etymology of the word, it's from the French stereotype, which was derived from the Greek stereo, which means solid. But the French word referred to a printing process where copies were made from a solid plate. So it doesn't change from product to product. And the archetypes are the original or the first form. So this is the thing from which all the copies are made.
It really illuminated things for me when I learned that uh, when Plato was talking about the realm of the forms, the ideal, the original of every particular thing, he was talking about archetypes. And the idea that, stereotypes are basically like you create this metal plate and then you just print and print and print and print and print and there's no variation. It's like there's room in the archetype of a horse for there to be black horses and white horses and horses with long manes and no manes and stereotypes. It's like you can only have one type of horse and they all have to look identical. And one of the things about copying is that before the digital age, if you were making copies of copies, then each copy would be a degraded version of the previous one. And so it's like that archetype is original, the source of the image. You used the word core essence when we were talking about this before we started recording. I thought that was such a good word.
And one thing about the archetype, if we're talking about the original, um, is that if you are working with one of those older printing presses, you can't just leave the original alone. Like if you've ever seen those plates, or I guess in more modern-ish printing presses, you have to do upkeep on the originals. Like you have to clean them, you have to make sure they stay in pristine condition, and you might, change them from time to time. And that was a really involved process because you were basically having to recreate it. Um, but that's one thing I didn't really consider when I was first, looking into archetypes and how we describe them, is that unlike stereotypes, there has to be some upkeep with the original for it to stay functional.
That makes a lot of sense. So, do you think it would be accurate to say that you get stereotypes, or one of the ways in which you get stereotypes is you have an archetype originally, but it isn't kept up and it's allowed to degrade?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think we see that happen on a societal level when stereotypes cause outbursts and violence against other groups of people that are different, from the norm. Because especially during COVID and in times when protests arise, a stereotyping causes violence. Like it's no longer a functional system in those situations.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It reminds me of before we before we started recording, You were sharing the research that you've done, and you said that you found one study that tried to justify stereotyping. And uh, can you remind me what they said about it?
So the one, and I went through there are numerous studies that I went through that, yeah, I could not find a good argument for stereotypes. And this one study had said that stereotypes are useful in that they allow us to compartmentalize and basically organize information, or in this case, people. Um, but from the way they were using useful, they didn't really mean useful, they meant convenient. Um, so we get into these situations where we have to really consider what we mean by useful when we talk about stereotypes being useful, and ask ourselves, is it useful because it allows us to make judgments faster, or is it convenient?
And when we were talking about this, eh, the only situation that we could think of in which it would be in which convenience and useful converge maybe is survival situations where you need to make snap judgments. And one of the things that you said that really stuck with me was how often are we in situations where we need to make really fast decisions like that? It's like we're artificially put into situations where we need to make snap judgments just by the speed of modern life at the risk of falling into stereotypes and cliches. But, when you're in a life and death situation, stereotypes allow you to move quickly. And, if you run away from a tiger that isn't actually coming after you, the worst thing that happens, is you get tired, or you do something, clumsy because you're tired and you get hurt. Um,
Or you
whereas if
catch their
you're
attention and then they actually come after you.
right, right. Um, whereas if you should be running and you don't run at all, then it just makes you easier prey. And it's like stereotypes, it almost sounds like they come from the same uh lizard brain fight or flight instincts that, yes, kept our ancestors alive and continue to keep us alive in situations where, somebody cuts us off in traffic or something. But the vast majority of the time, we we do have the privilege of being able to be slow and really get to know someone and not have to operate from stereotypes. Like, we don't most of us have the privilege of not moving through the world with warring tribes running around with machetes or something.
Yeah, and that is I think the most common example I think of when I think of like day-to-day situations where we have to make, and again, you don't have to make snap judgments. We are encouraged to make snap judgments to make our time at work more efficient.
Yes.
But the recruiter who has to go through God knows how many applications a day, um,
Mhm.
that is an area where stereotyping would certainly make things faster. And it does make things faster, but it doesn't make them right. Because
Mhm.
we talk about, um, discrimination in recruiting practices. And that is absolutely one of the biggest things that leads to, yeah, I mean, making wrong decisions. um, is we are in a work, a culture where we're rushed to make those decisions, and we feel like we have to be more efficient, but we don't. It's
Yeah.
just those kind of external pressures that trigger that, fight or flight thing that we
Yeah.
talked about.
our critical thinking skills go out the window as soon as we're in fight or flight. We can respond to threats, but the whole point of it is that it bypasses our deepest and best judgment making abilities for the sake of speed and reactivity. And we don't really want the people who are choosing our coworkers to be in a reactive, terrified state.
Exactly.
So I thought it might be good if we talk about archetypes versus stereotypes using the example of the sign Cancer. Before we pressed record, um, we were talking about how all of the signs of stereotypes and all stereotypes are damaging, but I feel like the stereotypes around Cancer are so visceral and speak to the heart in a very direct way, which I mean, everything about Cancer does. That's literally the point of Cancer. But as somebody who has three placements in Cancer, what do you see as the differences between Cancer stereotypes and Cancer the archetype?
So one of the, and I kind of have to outline one of the differences between archetypes and stereotypes because I forgot, and it'll be important to this,
Mm,
um, is how stereotypes typically focus on negative things. And by negative, I don't just mean bad, but like think about differences that take away from things. So the stereotype focus on differences between groups of people, where like we were kind of talking about earlier, the archetypes are that condensed core essence of a thing. It focuses on their strengths and their core needs. So when we're thinking about Cancer, an archetype of Cancer that we see a lot is um, a well, okay, so we have the mother as an archetype. Um, and that can be seen as an archetype. Um, but if we are looking at the stereotypical mother, a lot of those views of mothers are actually really disempowering because we have, you know, even, I mean, feminine stereotypes that, like being too emotional or completely irrational, letting their mood, rule their actions. All of these, being seen as needy and clingy and just all of these negative feminine things, which may or may not even be feminine. um, because I don't know, I've seen men do it too.
yes.
Anybody who says men can't be clingy needs to, yeah.
Hmm.
Um, but no, so those are going to be more stereotypes. Whereas if we look at the mother from an archetypal view, one of the core essences of the mother is nurturing. And this doesn't like refer to any sort of, it's just a, it's not necessarily good or bad, because we know we can over nurture things and baby them, but it is a quality that Cancer needs to either give or feel. Um, and I think nurturing or finding nutrients, depending on how you want to look at it, is core to the way Cancer operates.
That makes so much sense. And so it's really interesting to me how we've kind of got two buckets of stereotypes that just kind of get dumped on Cancer. There are the modern mothering stereotypes, and then there are the modern feminine stereotypes.
Mm-hmm.
When we were talking about this earlier, You shared this study with me that was done recently, um, that looked at the myth of man the hunter. You talk about that?
Um, yeah, so completely unrelated to this recording. I came across this article last week. Um, I can't even remember what I was looking up. I think it just somehow came up on my feed and one of the tools I use. And yeah, so there was a study, let's see, that basically it looks at the sexual division of labor among human foraging populations. And if we want to talk about stereotype busting, this whole, man hunts, woman stays home and watches the kids, or might gather on occasion. Um, this kind of this kind of throws that out the window. And I found this via an article, um, which I think we can link to. I hope we can link
Yes.
to. Um, Titled kind of appropriately, but even if it is a little off-putting, huge gendered lie about human evolution. Um, but I really liked the way they covered this because they talked about not just like it wasn't a lack of research that led to this assumption. It was the way they did the research that led to these assumptions. And that is, you have anthropology, a field that, at one point and might still be very male dominated. Of course, your researchers are going to want to look at people like them, which is men. But when they really started digging into this, the oh gosh, what was the number? I think it was they found that women. I said 70%. You said it was higher.
Yeah,
Um,
if I'm reading this article right, it's actually 79.
okay.
79% of the societies that they studied, women were involved in hunting as well as men.
Yes. And they go on to say that not only did, women participate in hunting, but they were still taking care of the children um, in some cases. So here they say either children would remain under the care of others while their mothers embarked on hunting expeditions, or women would bring their children along, take the
You
kids
compared
hunting.
that to mother bears, which I thought was so perfect.
Yes. Yeah. Oh, and lionesses, because you have, the lioness that does quite a bit of hunting for pride. And I mean, they bring the cubs hunting. They stash them, in tall grass while they go in for the kill. And like we see that in nature. So yeah, it seems like a very natural thing already.
And
And now we
it
have
makes
kind of evidence
sense.
to support that.
Yeah. And it makes sense. If this is going to be your life and your livelihood, then being exposed to it from a young age, you can, you know, I'm a mother of a 16-month-old, and imagining taking her out and having her watch me hunt is not something that I'm personally comfortable with. But, if this is your life and this is the way the world is and this is what your child is going to be growing up to do, then an important part of parenting is exposing your children to what you do within reason so that they can uh, learn how to do it for themselves. They watch and then they imitate and then they perform.
Yeah, and actually, now that I'm thinking about this, there was something kind of related. We were reading through a book called Regenerative Business that talks about basically aligning your business with natural cycles and just really like looking to nature for inspiration on running your business. And I haven't done the research on this, but she does mention in her book that um, you had women, the achievement, even though women did participate, the achievement still tended to follow the men. Um, so where women would primarily do, gathering, hunting was the big, achievement. Whereas in societies where gathering became the man's task, suddenly that was seen as more of an achievement. So, and it goes back to that, we have different stereotypes and they influence the way, I mean, one, who we give achievements to, apparently. But also, yeah, like it has such a pervasive influence that, yeah, we operate using stereotypes without ever really realizing it until we see the numbers
Yeah.
or we have some kind of mirror to reflect, like, how we're being.
Yeah. Stephen talks a lot about cleaning the lens, cleaning the stained glass that filters our perceptions. And I think that, you're talking about the same thing when you talk about archetypes needing to be repaired.
Mhm.
So I feel like this question is a little bit unfair because you have three planets in Cancer, and given the nature of Cancer, asking you how uh, Cancer stereotypes influence you is is maybe encouraging you to go against your nature a little bit. But if you're willing to talk about it, I am really curious about your experience.
It's actually kind of funny. Because while I do see cancer a lot in my own life, um, I don't fit the stereotype. Um, and I mean, I always kind of felt like I did when I was thinking about cancer from a very, cancer being the crab that likes to hide in the shell and kind of retreat from society. Like, I am super introverted and I like to
Mm.
hide. If I can hide behind something, I will. I did ghostwriting for like 5 years straight. So if I could get something published that didn't have my name on it, like I was, yeah, it was to the point where I couldn't even write pieces with my name attached to them. Little did I know I was getting a better deal because people pay more for ghostwriting, but
Oh my gosh.
um, but yes, that very kind of sheltered stereotype of cancer, I think I fit well. But when it comes to something we were talking about in Discord earlier, that being soft, I think was the word that was used. That is something I think most people associate with cancer. Soft and overly emotional, the crybaby. Um, and I get told all the time, I would have never, never thought you had cancer.
Yeah.
Because I mean, yeah, I am not a super like externally emotional person. I don't like showing my emotions. Um, it might be the end of the world if I break down crying in front of anybody.
Oh.
So, um, but yeah, so I think it's just one of those things that I can associate with some of those quieter aspects that most people don't see. Um, but as far as like the clingy emotional cancer, like it takes me a while to open up to people. So most people don't see that side of me.
That makes a lot of sense. I think that a lot of people would look at your chart and be like, oh, you have the moon in Capricorn, therefore you're not going to be a typical Cancer. And I think a lot of people would, kind of kind of put you up on this pedestal or off to the side as like, oh, you don't fit the mold, therefore you don't really count. But I feel like that very fact gets at the differences between stereotypes and archetypes because like in the stereotypical way of approaching things, because you don't quote unquote fit the mold, you get thrown away.
Mhm.
Whereas
You
people
get
who
written off
don't
as an
fit the
exception.
stereotype. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Whereas in reality, people who don't fit the stereotypes are living embodiments of doing archetypal repair. Because if we're talking about cancer as an archetype, you have to fit in that bucket because you have three placements there. And if you don't fit in the cancer archetype, then the problem isn't with you. The problem is with the archetype degrading into a stereotype.
Exactly.
As someone who also has a cancer ruled moon, I'm very passionate about this, as you can tell. So this has been an incredible conversation, I think. You are brilliant, and I love that you did research on this and brought studies that I can link to in the description. Uh, if people want to work with you, how can they connect with you? How can they work with you? Do you do readings? What's your, you know, again, dragging you out of your shell, but
So I mostly do tarot readings right now, over at tarotandchai.com. I do have my booking open for very limited time slots because I do not have the energy right now. um, yeah, cancer season is in full swing, and I am not here for it.
oh,
I'm in my shell. Um, Yes, so tarotandchai.com. I do a lot of career and vocational readings. So yeah, that's my bread and butter, career and vocation. I am testing out a new way of doing solar returns and annual perfections that kind of bring tarot in a little bit more. People that have previously gotten readings with me, it was just the solar return, just astrology, and I was kind of like leaving tarot out of it, but I've kind of brought those back together again. So,
so glad to hear it. You're such a brilliant tarot reader. You're a brilliant
ooh.
astrologer as well. But, when people ask for uh, references to a tarot reader, you are at the very top of the list of people that I recommend. So if you're listening to this, you should definitely get a reading from Lauren, and um I can highly recommend her help with career. If it wasn't for her help, I would not be a professional astrologer. So there's that. Thank you so much for coming on and talking with me about this stuff, Lauren. I think this has been amazing.
Yes, thank you for having me.
It's my pleasure. I always look for excuses to do this.